We'll see. I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of people who out there who argue that people don't want to play in dark worlds. So we will see. But ultimately, we never set out to make a game that was going to be a WoW competitor where we're trying to get millions of players. We're trying to find a dedicated audience that likes what we do and is willing to stick around and play it forever. That's really, I mean, that's, if I could wave a magic wand, that's my dream for this game, is to find a dedicated, loyal following. Doesn't have to be a huge one, but they love it. They're really happy with us. They're really happy with the game, and they play it forever.
Cool. So that is the lore part of what the NP is what a huge chunk of the design team has been working on.
That's the acronym for new player experience, right? And we're also, to be clear, I distinguish that from a tutorial, because a tutorial is generally something that most players want to skip. So I'm trying to make it actually much more interesting. That's one thing I have noticed, though, definitely, is historically, we've never spent a lot of time. We've spent all of our time building systems. We've spent very little of our time building things to explain those systems to players. So we have some incredibly deep systems, right? Our crafting system, there really hasn't been anything as deep as this since Star Wars Galaxies, I don't think, right? But to a new player coming in, there's no way they know that because we don't teach it. So these are the kind of things we want to just expose you to, so that as a player, you recognize, oh, here's where I need to go if I want to really explore the system.
Yeah, because if they start pattern matching it without a little bit of an explanation, right, we've got some survival elements, we've got some MMO elements, we've got some action there's just so many elements, and people are going to try and glom to what they know best. So that's what a huge chunk of the design team has been working on. Another chunk has been working on all of the stuff with fixing powers and all the feedback that you guys have been giving us with Frostweaver from the test server. And then a big chunk of the design or the engineering team has been working on optimization.
Yeah, performance. Yeah, specifically
performance
issues and frame rate.
Right. That has currently been the big high nail, is to try and get you guys the frame rate you need for big fights. So we've dedicated a good chunk of our engineering to fixing all of those things and optimizing all of the things.
Yeah. So with the new player experience, I've kind of divided it into 3 chapters. The first chapter is kind of the RPG basics, right? How do I level up my guy? How does the talent tree work? How does passive training work? And then I'm going to bounce you off of crafting and harvesting and scavenging and all those other pieces of the game as well. The second chapter then will likely be teaching you some of the basics of things like city building and caravans and stuff like that. And then by the third one, and this will be the most challenging, is when I need to get you into the strategy game. So that'll be the one that's going to be the hardest for me to figure out, and I'm not quite there yet. But I have a great team, and they're all pushing really, really hard to pull all the pieces together. And having played through the earliest rickety bridge version of the first chapter, I think it's going to help a lot. I can tell even now, just going through it with a whole bunch of the pieces that are like, oh, there's going to be a step here, it's just not quite working yet. I can already tell that it's going to expose people to a whole, because we have a lot of gameplay now. We actually have a huge number of systems. The problem is players either don't see it or they're overwhelmed by it. So we got to try and solve both of those problems with what we're doing right now.
Right.
So, and I'm not surprised that this is coming at the end of the project. That's pretty typical, because if you build it at the beginning, you break it constantly as the game changes, which it inevitably does. The first thing that always breaks is any scripted tutorial bits. So anyway, so that's what we've got going on right now.
Why are buildings only able to be ranked to level 3? They go from 0 effectiveness to uber effective in 2 quick jumps. This should be a longer and slower process. Give us 5 ranks and make the improved buffs more gradual. So let's talk about that for a second.
Actually, hold on. But before you do, let's give a little context for people who aren't familiar. So, okay. So once again, I apologize to you guys who this is old hat. Old hat, get it? Nice. So, okay. So in our campaign worlds, guilds can actually take over and build cities. We have a full city building system, and it's kind of like a civilization kind of thing, right? Where you go up to a foundation and you decide what it's a Class A building foundation, and you decide, do I want this to be a bell tower, or do I want this to be something else? And then you build the thing up by actually going to caravan runs. You go and you get raw materials, you drag them back, you try to avoid being killed on the way there, and then you feed those into the building foundations, and then you get to pick what that building turns into. So those buildings start at a foundation state, like you can actually see it's all built out like a foundation. And then as you're feeding it materials, and you get additional benefits for your guild, not just in the city, but in that entire zone, that entire world. You get additional benefits based on the rank of those buildings. And the goal here was to make it to where there are more building options than you have the capacity to build. So you have to make hard choices. Do I want the barracks or do I want the armory? Giving you options we thought would lead to more interesting and diverse gameplay. So, so the question, this particular question, is about the number of ranks we offer per building, because we decided to basically make it 3 ranks. So every building has 3 ranks. That's different than the city, because the city actually has more granularity and you can upgrade the walls. But we're talking about the building, the specialty buildings specifically. Yep. So there you go. So I gave the context. Blair, why don't you give the answer, and then I'll see if I agree with you.
The 1 to 5 would make more sense if it was a permanent thing. But when I was doing the math early on and talking with Todd, these buildings are, in a lot of cases, they're going to get destroyed during a siege, which means that you're going to probably have to rebuild a couple of them as the campaign goes on. And we didn't want to go with a very painful process. Getting rank 1 and 2 is very quick, in fact, for a reason, because we want you to have those things when you've picked that building. The rank 3 ties more into victory cards, and it is harder to get. But again, these things are probably going to be casualties of sieges in many cases. So the more painful we make it, the more painful sieges, which we don't want it to be. We want it to sting, but we don't want it to feel like, man, I just lost everything and there's no way I can rebuild in this campaign. Right? So that's why getting to rank 1 is a very inexpensive process in the terms of material requirements. 2 is a little more, and 3 is where the big jump is. But if we had another 2 in there, again, it would just it would feel like you had to do too much to repair a city after it had been shelled. Because then, again, that's one of the things that we talked about when we were building dregs was, what if they don't want to come in and destroy the walls? What if they just want to shell the city and knock down buildings, which they totally can, because that's going to lead towards potential victory card scenarios where they win. And victory cards is the system that governs the entire campaign process now.
Yeah, I did want to make sure also that the tiers didn't feel that when you got a bump to the next rank of building, that it felt weighty. I wanted to actually have it feel like, hey, this is a noticeable improvement. That's something that you struggle with in RPGs a lot, right? Is the more granularity you give, if you have X amount that you can put on a player to keep them within a range of balance, and you spread that over 100 levels instead of over 10, then by definition, you're giving a lot less per level. Right. So that happens here as well, as I just wanted to make sure that they feel impactful. I mean, as with everything else, we will certainly play it and we'll see how it feels. And if we need to make a change, we certainly can. But as of right now, I think it's probably at least a good place to start, if nothing else.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, which is because of this being a PvP game and there's progression in there, we have a budget for everything. So, and we keep we try and keep our power budget in check.
You mean a balanced budget, not like a money budget, though that does come into play as well,
yeah,
right?
Like please explain what you mean when you say budget, because it makes it sound like, we're exchanging money.
It's a we just don't endlessly give out stats, because then you end into a scenario where you have characters that are extremely overpowered compared to a lot of the other characters. So we have a stats budget. And if we give you something over here, it has to come from somewhere else. So that's in fact a lot of what we started to see in 5.1.10 is shifting things around such that maybe jewelry is more impactful. We'll get to that question later, because it has a higher stats budget now. But that budget had to come from somewhere. So we pulled it out of the vessel, for example. So there you go.
And I know that, so I'll comment one more thing on that, is it seemed like math, right? So you could just be like, oh, well, then if you need more budget, then instead of giving out 100 things, give out 200. That's true, except that it's all a percentage at the end of the day, right? So if I move the model from 100 to 1,000, all I've done really is added a 0 to all my numbers. I haven't fundamentally changed it, right? So when you're talking about what percentage of the overall damage bonus comes from rings, the number that results out of that is kind of irrelevant. It's really the percentages, and you only have, as it turns out, about 100% to work with in most cases.
So we got the Frostweaver, which is our newest class.
Cool.
Right.
And the last class that we needed for launch, which is
Correct.
really cool.
Also, it's a very interesting class in that they're all about coalescing ice and shaping it to their will, right? They're basically bending the elements to their will, and they're creating some type of object in the world that does a thing. Well, in our first pass of the Frostweaver, again, the first time you put a class out, you guys know what happens. That class is always a little overpowered. Some mechanic may or may not work, or not, right? Generally, we err on, right. We err on the side of power, and sometimes we just don't know how things are going to work out. In this case, players were creating an absolute flood of ice in the world, and there was really no way to limit it, and people didn't know how many kinds they could make or what kinds. So we've created a chart for you. And Emily, if you could bring that chart up. Basically, because I'll describe it as we walk through it, which is there are basically two top categories to ice. Permanent ice is what we're calling one kind, and temporary ice, which is what we're calling the other kind. And if you look at that chart over in the permanent category, you've got the ice armor, you've got stable ice, you've got frigid ice, and you've got cooling ice. Those are our permanent ice types. And then over on the other side, we have ice that's basically going to appear in the world and explode and do a thing, which is what we're calling temporary ice. So we found that an unlimited amount of a thing was generally not good for performance or for balance. So we had engineering give us a way to create a cap to the amount of permanent ices that you can create. And the thing is if you create over your cap, it destroys the oldest one and recreates one where you wanted it to go. So if you're limited to 3 kinds or 3 ices out max, and you put a 4th down, it's going to eat the first one, and you're still at 3, right? So this chart also shows the ice types that you can switch between. It shows that ice armor can't be transmuted, and it shows you that the other permanent ice can be temporarily turned into the other ice and exploded. So I just wanted to get this out here, but it also shows we definitely need to communicate this in game. So at some point, our UI team is going to give us a spot where we can put graphics like this, probably off the talent tree, which will explain key mechanics for that class.
Any chance of getting a Dregs campaign up? What is the status on that, on getting the new Dregs campaign up? And the other question, and this is for people who are new, often ask us about dates, like when's beta going to start? When are we going to launch? So,
okay, so let me take both of those in turn. So first of all, what we're waiting on for the next Dregs campaign is we have a small targeted list of bugs that we feel like if we put up a campaign and we don't fix these, then people will just have a bad experience. So we're trying to get those fixed. I think it was at like 11 or 12 this morning. Of those, there's also a handful of them that are performance related, dealing with either frame rate issues or hitching. We saw a number of new issues come up just recently where the game will kind of hitch, like you're playing along and things are fine, or even your frame rate's pretty good, but then all of a sudden you kind of just have a momentary freeze. And when you come out of it, because we're action combat, you're now pointed in a different direction. It's just a bad experience. So we put a really strong effort over the last 2 weeks to get people on trying to fix to isolate and fix those. It's not just one hitch. That's the thing. That's the hitch. It's not just one problem. It's actually a handful of them that surface, but they look similar. So it wasn't as simple as fix this one problem and all of them go away. So we are one by one, we've been knocking them down. As of this morning, when I looked at the list, there was only one still on there. But that doesn't mean we got them all. That just means we got all the ones that we found. So what'll happen is we'll have to get it back in front of the players. You guys have way more like different configurations of machines and environments than we have. And we have a much larger group of players than we do a group of QA. We find everything we can internally, but inevitably some stuff slips through the cracks. That's why it goes to test server. So hopefully we'll get another version out here soon, but we got to get through that list first. So my guess is it won't be this weekend. It'll probably be early next week. That's kind of a bit of a guess. So the second question is about beta, and I don't have a firm answer on that one either. So we need to get all of these issues in this current build fixed, right? The list I talked about. We have another host of issues that are actually already flagged for being fixed in this build, but wouldn't stop us from doing our next dregs run on test. And then the last piece is I want to get at least that first chapter of the 3 chapters of the new player experience up and solid, because when we go into beta, we're going to be opening up to a much larger group of people than we ever have before, right? We've got, I don't know where it is now. It's north of 350,000 signups, I think south of 400,000. So somewhere, call it 370 or something like that. I think that's roughly in the right ballpark. Once we start to do invites from there, we're going to see a lot of people flooding into the game. And I know right now that people coming into the game get lost. They have no idea what they're doing because there is no new player experience. So before we can get, that's when we start to do those invites, that's beta. That's when we'll actually announce beta. In between now and then, we'll announce alpha. It's kind of a non-event for us because we've been in pre-alpha so long, and I just don't think alpha is a big thing to make a big celebration out of. It's just, It's kind of an internal milestone. We will announce it at some point soon, but beta to me is when things get a lot more interesting because we'll start to see a lot of people flood into the game. I mean, so one of the things that's a little weird about testing, balance testing specifically right now, is we're testing dregs campaigns where we have, a couple hundred people on the test server all running around in campaign worlds that were provisioned for 2,000. So so that it's going to fundamentally change the way the dregs feels once we actually start to see population numbers. And when will we start to hit those numbers? We'll start to hit it when we start to invite in waves of 5,000 people in a weekend. So all of that is coming, and that's probably why you'll notice we're being more hesitant on propping builds to test and live. It's because we're starting to gear up our cadence to get closer to where we need to be at launch. And that means spending more time fixing more things. In the past, we would have already probably taken the quality level we had now and moved it live. We've decided not to do that because we need to start getting used to the idea of this thing being launched. So anyway, long-winded answer, but hopefully, and I know it wasn't specific as saying it's next Thursday. I'd love to give an answer like that, but I'm always wrong. So instead, I tell you the criteria that we use to judge internally, and then you can understand why things take what they take, or at least you can understand the idea behind the madness.
Yes, there is a method. There clearly is.
Yeah.
Okay, so can I ask some more questions? These are from the stream today. Because we've got 10 more minutes, maybe 15 since we started a little late. Royo33 asks why energetic harvesting is so hard to unlock. It was the fun part of harvesting, and now you need 3 months to unlock, and harvesting is boring. Which seems to me like there's got to be something in there. I still enjoy harvesting, and I think that those of us who've been playing for a while, we had a chance to build our skills up, and we're not used to how long it can take.
Yeah,
and so a little bit of it is just kind of an attitude adjustment. And
we are playing with that, right? We are looking at some things that are gated by passive training that I feel like are core to the experience, and we're pulling them forward. One of the things in the new player experience we did was mounts, right? We had gated your first saddle. We gated that a little bit into one of the trees, and we talked about it. We're like, you know what? I would rather, as the new player experience, give you a starting mount and have it ungated, because I think it just makes the overall experience feel better. So that's definitely something we're going to have to take a look at. Remember that this is the first time we're seeing the skill training slowed down to 1x instead of 3x as well. So we're going to inevitably make some adjustments. So this is a valid one. Is part of the reason that we pushed some of these things out is our game, like I mentioned earlier, it has actually a lot of systems, right? It's got a lot of weird little interesting loops that we developed over time. The harvesting mini game with the pips is one of those. I felt like it was adding complexity to a new player that was not giving the payoff, right? It was just adding another thing for players to learn. So I suggested, Blair, let's kick that out and make it something that you don't get unless you invest a little bit into harvesting. So as a result, he kicked it out. Now, did we kick it too far? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, so
sure.
this scratches on a really good topic, which is prior to this, we just built stuff and put it in front of everyone, and you guys acclimated to all those new systems because you had learned the previous ones, you saw the new thing, and it was interesting to you, and you had access to everything from the moment go. The challenge with bringing new people into that is there's 75 things we're throwing at your face in the period of 5 minutes. And one of the reasons for progression in RPG systems is A, they're rewards, but B, you need time to figure out how to learn things. You just do. Otherwise, you're just going to blow right through it. Or the true gem in a lot of things is just a little deep in, and you never make it there because it's so overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
So we try and give it to you in little chunks. So you're going to start to see a lot of that as we move forward now is how many things is the proper things to give you at a time? What should be rewards, and how far out are those rewards? I know
we're at least spacing it, and when we do introduce it, giving you some context for what we're introducing, right? Which the new player experience gives us a chance to do for the first time, right? Previous to this, if I'm running around in the game and I want to get some hide, there was nothing that told me, yeah, to do that you need a skinning knife. That just wasn't. So the way you would learn it is you had to either watch these Q&As, which is not particularly efficient as a communication mechanism for teaching the game, or you had to go to the forums, which is, again, not ideal. So as we now can introduce those things, I think some of them we maybe end up pulling back. And then some of them, quite frankly, just won't make the cut. Like we had this mini game that Blair put in, it must have been at least a year ago, right? Where you would collect multiple sacrifice scrolls and you would combine them together in crafting, and then you would get a sacrifice treasure item that, as a result of combining them, gave you more experience. So he did that because we had no questing, no other mechanism to do that. Now that we actually have some of those systems coming online, we can come up with better ways to do that, right? Instead of just a scroll that each war tribe has one and they don't stack, and so now I've bloated my inventory with a whole bunch of items that I may or may not care about. We're going through and actually putting in dedicated treasure items for each war tribe, which I think will be a better solution. It'll look cooler. It'll make more sense to new players. It's not another thing that they have to learn. Now, like I mentioned earlier, all the trains don't come into the station at once. So some of those have started to hit. We pulled out the combination thing, and as a result, we haven't rebalanced experience points or put in the new player experience. So all the players, you guys, feel is, hey, wait a second, there was a thing that gave me experience, and now I don't get it anymore. What the hell? Yeah, I know. Yes, of course. We'll get to it. It's just, that's the problem with playing and eating food that's coming out of the kitchen when some of it's only half-baked. I don't have a way to fix that other than just, explain it and say thank you for being patient as we try and get this stuff resolved.
Amaranth 2517 asked if there's any way to stop people from defending their strongholds by logging out, logging in alt characters, or is it intended mechanics for sieges?
Yeah, I've gone around on this on alt characters being placed in other places. There are some solutions. So one that we talked about, again, we discuss this stuff internally, right? We talk about this kind of stuff all the time. One of the solutions was, well, let's just lock out alts from campaigns, or not all campaigns, make it a knob. Does this campaign allow you to have alts, or are you restricted to only one? I floated that by some players, and the response was mixed, so I don't love that. Another option is that if I log a character, basically just pay attention to the log back in rules. And if I go from one character to another one, and then I go back to the first one, that one bounces all the way back to the temple. So we could actually adjust the location. That one might have merit. So this is one where let me put it this way: is I'm open to ideas and suggestions. It was not the intended behavior. In fact, it's kind of undercutting. We wanted to make it harder for one group or one guild to own more and more locations. Like the difficulty should scale up with each additional location I'm trying to hold. It should become that much harder. And partially, I think there's some design changes we could make to fix this, and partially it's another one of those areas where I'm not sure if what we're seeing in the test right now is necessarily indicative of the actual game. Because again, when you have 10% of your players or 15% of your expected players logging into a world that's provisioned for a full, entire complement, things that normally would not be as easy or as difficult are suddenly much easier to pull off, right? It's much easier for a small group to lock down an entire zone if they have 1/10 of the amount of enemies and opponents that we expect them to be up against. So I am open to ideas on it, though. We don't have all the answers on this stuff. Some of this is inevitably us iterating and trying things out, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't.
Said, speaking of thralls, are they only in campaigns? I've looked for days and haven't found a single one. Where are those thralls at? And explain for people who may not be familiar with them why thralls are important and why you need to.
First of all, what is a thrall? So thralls are basically our ghost, right? We talked about the lore earlier and how the heaven is gone and hells are closed, and now you've got all these ghosts basically kind of wandering around the world. So we've got them to where they're rigged up to where the thralls, these ghosts, these spirits only show up at night. So we have a day-night cycle in the game, and if it's during the day, you're not going to find them. So that'd be step one. If you can't find them, is stop looking during the day. And then number two is they have a random spawn set up on them where they don't always appear in the same location. So if you're camping a spot where one showed up, hoping it'll respawn, you're probably not going to see it in the same spot again. It's going to now pop somewhere else in the world. So the second half of that is, why are they important? They have basically they have unique loot drops, as if you want to net it out, right? Specifically, Blair talked about the subclassing system earlier that we use, which is discipline. So if I want to take archery, or if I want to dabble in being an assassin or whatever, I can go and find discipline runestones and apply them to my character. And that's how I get the kind of multi-classing or the subclassing in our system. The best of those drop on thralls. The combat ones anyway, drop on thralls. So, and as in terms of where do they pop, I know there's some in Infected, and I know there's definitely some in Dregs. I actually don't know if they pop in God's Reach. Blair, do you know?
The common ones do, like the Thrall Cleric and the Thrall Knight, if I'm not mistaken. But the named ones, like the Blade Master or the Dryad, do not.
So part of the idea here, again, I mentioned earlier, is risk reward, right? If you want the cool stuff, then we're trying to entice you to go into more and more dangerous areas. The other is that we're trying to create an economy loop where players who don't want to do that, but are more interested in playing the game, the economic loop, the crafting loop, trying to set up their own personal Eternal Kingdom, they can let other players go brave the worlds for them, bring those things back. And now, if I'm a crafter and I've made really, really great weapons, I have something to sell to the combatant who's willing to go to the dangerous areas. That gives that combatant something now to sell to me, because that combatant can bring back things that are in areas that I'm not willing to go to. So that's part of getting that whole loop working. We still have some stuff we need to do there, especially with the Eternal Kingdoms. They technically work, but like we have them to where right now, if enough people aren't logged into them, they shut down and things like that. Some of that is us we need to turn it on, and we just haven't quite gotten there yet. So it's coming. All of that's coming.